Thanks to everybody who's joining us on the call, especially after a nice, restful Easter weekend. And I mean, I'm so excited about today's webinar because, first of all, the publication we're going to discuss elements of by the IMF called Unleashing Growth and Strengthening Resilience in the Caribbean. I mean, this is really one of those seminal pieces of work that it's so multifaceted and so broad and comprehensive, discussing all of the issues that we face in the Caribbean and the challenges and the solutions as well, which is why I like it. And we also have some of the authors from that book and co-author, and sorry, editor. And let me just introduce everybody else on the call, but I just wanted to say that I'm so grateful that this work has been done in the Caribbean by the IMF, and so many people have poured so many hours of blood, sweat, and tears into this. I know how hard these kinds of research publications are to do, and so I just want to express my gratitude to the IMF for putting this piece of work out there that people like me can cite and can reference and can help shape policy and in essence our recovery, hopefully, ultimately. So on the webinar this morning, we have Ramakrishnan, and she is the Assistant Director in the IMF and Division Chief of the Caribbean 2 Division. She is currently the Mission Chief for Jamaica and has been since 2015. So all of the good things we see happening in Jamaica, she's had a hand in that. And Jamaica obviously is a poster child in the Caribbean for how fiscal responsibility and other types of reforms can really unleash growth in a country that is still heavily indebted. We also have Joyce Wong. She is an economist in the IMF, and her work is focusing on areas like female labor force participation, financial inclusion, and immigration, 3 very important issues to us in the Caribbean. And so we're very happy to have you join us this morning, Joyce. And we have Sebastian Acevedo. He's, as Melissa and I joke, and we call him the hurricane guy. He's the guy who's done all of the very important and sexy work you see published by the IMF that quantifies the amount of damage that hurricanes of different categories do, and how many hurricanes we've had and how much damage has been done to these economies. Nobody else is doing this kind of work, and I congratulate Sebastian for this important work that he's doing in the region, and help put some sometimes depressing but important context to just how devastating natural disasters, especially hurricanes, are in this region. So I'm going to turn over now to Uma. Do we have Governor Antwine yet, Melissa? No?
No, he's connecting. He'll be on short.
Okay. So as soon as Governor Antwine, Governor of the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, joins us, I'll have him also share his thoughts. But for now, I'll turn over to Uma to give us her thoughts.
Good morning. Thank you, Marla, for that introduction. And good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. As Marla mentioned, the IMF just launched in November last year a book called Unleashing Growth and Strengthening Resilience in the Caribbean, where we brought together a whole series of analytical work that we had done related to the Caribbean. And a big part of the 2 big parts of the book are one that looks at macroeconomic issues and the other that looks at structural issues. And what I want to present right now is on the macroeconomic side, in particular about policy discipline, and further into that, what I want to talk about is fiscal policy discipline. And Joyce and Sebastian, who will follow, will talk a bit more on the structural side of issues. So I want to talk about, next slide, please. So yes, so what I want to talk about is policy discipline, and the focus I'm going to place on today is the 2 country cases that we have worked on the Caribbean that we think are at least in the process of becoming successful stories. That's Grenada and Jamaica. But I think the lessons that have been learned from these 2 countries are far more widely applicable than just these 2 countries. To put things in context, I mean, in the limited time I have today, I don't think I can do full justice to everything that these two countries have accomplished in terms of getting their fiscal house in order, or at least in the process of achieving that. But I just want to highlight a few important things that I think have helped them bring their debt down and impose fiscal discipline. The slide that you're seeing now on elections and fiscal policy is really to highlight what has been a historical problem in not just these two countries. I think it's a Caribbean-wide problem. And many of the things that I'm going to say, while I'm highlighting these two cases, I think most of the Caribbean countries, like we have shown in the book, most of the countries can relate to the problems, which are long, prolonged decades worth of high debt and fiscal policy that has contributed to this high debt, which has resulted in a lot of crowding out and low growth and several other structural issues that have also contributed to low growth. But what I'm showing here in this is how the electoral cycles tend to lead to policy reversals in some of these countries. And why do I say that? It is because there is a need to entrench fiscal policy discipline beyond what each government is able to do. It needs to be entrenched in some shape or form so that elections don't necessarily create a reversal in the policies that, in the surpluses or the improved policies that sometimes some governments tend to undertake. So what you're seeing here is the yellow bars are the elections that have taken place, and the blue line is the primary balance that is going through. And while this is not establishing causality, and I want to be clear about that, this is just showing a pattern of potential relationship between primary balance reversals and elections. So as elections approach, there is a tendency for governments to reverse their surpluses. So that to me is sort of forming the basis, that's the foundation for why fiscal policy discipline is needed. Next slide, please. So why is fiscal discipline necessary? When we had the Caribbean conference, the high-level Caribbean forum that we call in Jamaica last year, in Kingston in November, where the managing director attended, our keynote speaker was Peter Blair Henry, who then was the dean of the Stern Business School of New York University. And I'm quoting two quotes from him from his speech for why discipline is important. And he said, discipline drives turnaround, and discipline is practical. It's not ideological. So I want to use that as the theme for why fiscal discipline has actually worked in the two country cases that I am going to discuss briefly today. So why does discipline drive turnaround? And by discipline here, what we are referring to is mostly on the fiscal side. So what are the economic benefits of discipline? The clear benefits of economic discipline are, one, the inflation is low. Why is that? Because if you're disciplined, then your economy doesn't overheat and your aggregate demand is not beyond where it should be. It is consistent with where your cycle is. And as a result, your inflation is maintained low, and there is no, and if the expansion in aggregate demand is not supported by increase in productivity, then your inflation is clearly going to be higher. And that does not materialize if there is a disciplined approach to policy making. The second economic benefit of discipline is the low cost of capital. Jamaica is an outstanding example of how the cost of capital has been reduced over the last 5-6 years. Jamaica's interest bill to GDP, government's interest bill to GDP was nearly 12% of GDP before the program began in 2013. And through debt exchanges, through disciplined fiscal policy, where they have run primary surplus of higher than 7% of GDP, and through very active debt management, liability management, they have brought their interest bill down to about 7%, and by next year and end of next year, it is likely to be around 6 and then go down to 5% of GDP. That is a phenomenal achievement, considering how high and how much unproductive spending it was for the government to just be paying interest on its very high debt. So, and Jamaica also can boast that in the international placement that it did last year, it was the lowest. The cost for what they placed was the lowest in history, and it was like 5.25%, which is fantastic. And even today, I believe that Jamaica is trading at yields that are lower. The spread against other emerging market, the MB spread, is much lower than many much larger emerging market countries. So the markets are recognizing that the country is doing better and the cost of capital has reduced. The ability of the country to absorb shocks. Now, when you have public debt so high and your interest bill is so high and your inflation is running so high, the space that you have to respond to any shock, and we know that the Caribbean region has repeated shocks. Needless to say, Sebastian will talk more about it. Natural disasters is a feature of the Caribbean every single year. So if the government does not have the fiscal space to respond to these shocks, it incurs higher debt, and then the vicious cycle just keeps getting exacerbated. So discipline does help to create some fiscal space that would be needed to respond to shocks, which is especially important in many countries that have a fixed exchange rate regime. And the last, I would say, is a faster growth. Now, this is still being tested in Jamaica. We are not quite seeing the growth that that we would like to see, but there are reasons for that, and we can get into that a little later. But the Grenadian economy has seen faster growth, and in general, emerging market countries that benefited from almost 2 decades of very fast growth bypassed the Caribbean completely. So, the lack of fiscal discipline and the lack of disciplined policy making did impact growth in a very significant way for the Caribbean region. So those are just some of the economic benefits of discipline. What policies, what does it mean to say discipline is practical and not ideological? We are not talking about, I hate the word, but I will say it, neoliberal policies that people often associate for achieving these kinds of fiscal discipline or achieving these types of turnarounds. We are talking practical policy making. We are talking about achieving macroeconomic stabilization. That is not magic. That is it may require magic to achieve it, but it is not something out of the ordinary. If you want to lower your inflation, if you want to reduce your current account deficit, if you want to increase your reserves so that you're able to absorb shocks, if you want to reduce your fiscal deficit, these are very fundamental needs in order to achieve macroeconomic stabilization. That's one thing. The second policy is instituting the rule of law. There has to be some discipline in the way the country is run and in the way in which it is predictable so that the rule of law is actually followed and businesses understand that there is a recourse should things go wrong. The third thing for countries is to have a market-based allocation of resources. In many of them, this I would associate also with a modest role for government. I would say these two are combined in a certain way, particularly in the Caribbean, where government takes a very expansive role in an economy, where the government, the arms of the government are pretty much everywhere. Again, to quote this example of Jamaica, and I'm not using Jamaica, I just know the country well, and therefore I'm using it as an example. Jamaica has, as of 2016, at the start of the current standby arrangement, it had 180 public bodies, 180 public bodies. For a country with a population of 2.8 million, I would have to say it is one of the highest on a per capita basis of how much public body is associated with each citizen. And that needs to be streamlined. The role for government has to be narrowed so that the market and the private sector is able to play a more active role in shaping the economy. And lastly, I would also say in terms of it's practical and not ideological, is also to know that there is no generic formula. There is no magic silver bullet that is going to help all countries in the same way. This is a very customized solution. And fiscal doesn't necessarily mean that it is strict austerity for a prolonged period of time or a short period of time, or whether it is front-loaded or it is low or it is fast. It is a customized solution that has to be based on what are the needs of the country, what are the circumstances of the country, and therefore what policies would help that country by understanding the circumstances in which it is at that time. Next slide, please. So let me focus on the two countries just to give a brief idea. Again, I'm not going to be able to do full justice to the case studies, but just to give you a quick snapshot, and I'm happy to answer any questions related after this. The case of Jamaica. Okay, so as you can see in that chart, Jamaica in 2013 had at its peak debt of about 147% of GDP. It was reaching a point of crisis where the reserves had reached significantly low levels. There were only a few weeks of 6 weeks of reserves left, I believe, for covering imports of goods and services. And so it had reached a point where the cost of borrowing was very high, and something had to be done. And that is when, and this was after prolonged engagement with the fund, where Jamaica had been in and out historically in terms of the fund supported programs. But when 2013 came, and in 2013, when the government had actually won the election at that time in 2012, it was interesting context because the opposition, the then opposition, had talked about so-called bitter medicine. The current Prime Minister, Andrew Holness, who at that time was in the opposition, when running for the election in 2012, had talked about a bitter medicine. And the current government, the government of that time, the PNP government that won the election in 2012, if I may say so, that did not go well with the people. However, when the PNP government came to power, it realized that it had no choice because the debt levels had hit such high proportions that something had to be done to stabilize this economy. There was a joint force. I think the country came together in understanding that enough is enough. The country had already at that time, by then, 2013, gone through 2 debt exchanges, and the private sector and the bankers said enough is enough. Society at large said enough is enough. And even the 2 political parties, the 2 major political parties said enough is enough. And they all agreed, and that is how this program came together. And 5 years from then, we are in 2018, with an administration change in the meantime. The then opposition is now the current government. And you see that the continuity of that fiscal discipline, the policy that was entrenched in the fiscal responsibility law that was passed in 2014 is ongoing. And now I would add that the fiscal responsibility law that was passed in 2014 was in a sort of light form already there in 2010 when the previous JLP government was in power. There was a fiscal responsibility law light that was already existing. And what the 2014 law did was actually to entrench it and be, in a way that has made it credible, because the country has been following the path necessary in order to bring the debt down to 60% of GDP, which is the goal for the country by fiscal year 25-26. And as you can see, the yellow part of the slide there is showing the projection of how we expect the debt trajectory to evolve, leading them to the 60% of GDP. So they are completely on track to achieve this target. And what I think the key lessons for the region as a whole from the Jamaican experience is that the continuity of policy across governments, the policy reversals that I showed in the first slide, that during an election the governments tend to reverse their policy course, did not happen. And across 2 governments, and over 5 years, they have maintained that trajectory, which has enhanced their credibility, which has entrenched their macroeconomic stability, which has lowered their cost of capital, and the ownership that the Jamaican people at large are showing to make sure that the debt does not go up to another wrong trajectory again is a big factor, a huge driver in holding the discipline and holding the government accountable. So the institutionalization of the fiscal discipline has been a huge factor. And what are the results of this fiscal discipline? As I mentioned before, the debt has been reducing, macroeconomic stability is entrenched, inflation is at significant low, cost of borrowing is at historical low. Employment and job creation are at historical highs. The FX reserves are rising very quickly. Exchange rate flexibility is being maintained in the case of Jamaica. The business environment is improving. What is not happening, at least to the extent that we would like to see, is growth. And there are some idiosyncratic factors there that are hitting Jamaica periodically, particularly on the agricultural side, where weather swings keep hitting Jamaica. It's either a drought or a flood, and the country simply does not have the resilience to absorb these shocks, and that's going to take time. But there is awareness and work going in the direction of building the resilience, and hopefully that will help remove this impact of agriculture on growth in a negative way. And the other big factor in Jamaica and other regions and other countries in the region is also crime. Crime is a big factor which does impact private investment and confidence to some extent. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is my last slide, and I want to touch on Grenada very quickly, which is also a similar story where a crisis had to be a crisis scenario had to be reached before the government would take on fiscal discipline as a serious measure. Grenada too had gone through a series of IMF programs prior to the 2014 program. And it was near crisis in 2014, but the expansion in public debt began way back in 2004 when Hurricane Ivan happened. The public debt started growing. As you can see, it was 40% and it reached as high as 110% at its peak in 2014 when the program with the IMF, the ECF began. And then again, it was the country that came together to build a fiscal responsibility and institutionalized fiscal discipline. And similar story where a homegrown monitoring committee was created. In the case of Jamaica, EPOC, or the Economic Program Oversight Committee, was created in the first program, which has been further broadened for other oversight committees in the standby arrangement. And the results for Grenada are, as again the chart shows, they are on the right trajectory to meet their debt targets as entrenched in the fiscal responsibility law, which is also 60% of GDP. To us, just for to be clear, the fiscal responsibility laws do have flexibility in terms of if there are natural disasters, or if primary balance, the course correction is needed, how can the course be corrected? And in the case of Jamaica, there is the Auditor General takes a close look to determine whether the budget or the supplementary budgets are in line with the goals of the fiscal responsibility law. And in Grenada, there is FROC, what they call the FROC, or the Fiscal Responsibility Oversight Committee, which also takes accountability and holds the government accountable to the targets set in the fiscal responsibility law. And the results in the case of Grenada, the debt is on a downward trajectory, on track to meet the debt target. Fiscal sustainability is being restored. In the case of Grenada, growth has been, there were significant highs for the first 2 years of the program. There are other factors that are more specific to Grenada, such as the citizenship by investment and a few other idiosyncratic factors which feature in the story on Grenada, and I'm not going to get into those details. But the general takeaway from both these experiences is that, as I show in the next slide, Melissa, sorry. The lessons are that unfortunately in these two countries, sorry, it's not in the deck of slides that I sent. Apologize. Both these countries sought to get into fiscal discipline from a moment of crisis, but that does not have to be the case. Given the experiences and the results that is being evidenced by these two countries, it is, I think, important for countries to take charge of fiscal discipline as a policy path in order to get their public debt down and create the fiscal space to absorb shocks. And what the other lesson is that the country, the ownership and the public appetite for fiscal discipline has to be there in order for the whole country to buy in and own the discipline that is needed. So the partnership that is required across society is critical, and accountability and holding the government accountable to these targets is also critical. I will stop there, and when the Q&A session begins, I'll be happy to answer any further questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Uma. Okay, so we'll switch over now to Sebastian and Joyce. We're having some problems connecting Governor Antwine, just letting those of you on the call.
Marla, I'm on the call, eh?
Oh, lovely. Lovely to hear your voice, Governor Antwine. So for the benefit of those on the call, I just want to introduce Governor Antwine. He is the governor of the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, and by that definition, the biggest central bank in the Caribbean, with responsibility for 8 countries, many of whom were affected last year and years gone by the hurricanes, and a few of whom, Grenada in particular, that Uma just discussed, have been involved in IMF programs and have had fiscal responsibility frameworks, in particular in the case of Grenada, implemented. Governor, we'll pause to give you your chance to give us your thoughts now before we switch over to Sebastian and Joyce.
Okay, so thank you, Marla, and thanks for having me. I want to thank you for this initiative. I commend Uma and the other editors and contributors of this book for what I consider is a very thoughtful and timely contribution to the discourse on Caribbean development at this time, coming as it is on the heels especially of the brutal hurricane season we had last year. It is no secret that inclusive growth has been a distinct challenge for our region over the last 2 decades, and especially since the global financial crisis. And therefore, this book is, in my opinion, a smorgasbord of some of the most pressing issues confronting the Caribbean today, whether that is the fiscal issues, the citizenship by investment, loss of correspondent bank relations, crime, energy, financial sector issues. The book covers quite a number of those issues, and therefore it's a welcome addition at this time. I think it's imperative that the issues raised in the book be widely discussed, and that these discussions help create appetite and space for the critical reforms identified in the various chapters. So, for example, on the issue of fiscal responsibility, frameworks, which I frankly prefer to call fiscal resilience. And let me just say, in pursuing this dialogue and encouraging reform, words matter. And so I have moved away from using the terms fiscal rules and even fiscal responsibility because it appears to offend some, and it gets in the way of having a very focused and a progressive and a constructive dialogue about how we go forward to protect our economies and to give us the best chance to succeed long term in terms of inclusive growth. So I just make that observation in passing. We may want to look at how we frame these issues because we want to make sure that people understand the benefit. I find sometimes when we talk fiscal discipline, people begin to think this is about the IMF, this is about somebody else outside of our country, and the discipline for whom and for what. If we frame it in terms of the benefit, the protection for the people, the understanding that fiscal resilience framework allows us to pursue counter-cyclical fiscal policy when there are shocks. We protect the population and therefore minimize the hardships that we will go through when there are downturns. We help to give the government the wherewithal to be able to respond quickly and more effectively when a shock arises, whether it's a natural disaster or economic shock. Those things may help to take the conversation forward and avoid the sort of defensive posture that we sometimes see from some governments who are concerned that it is somehow they're being construed as being irresponsible in some way. Now, I'm not suggesting that past fiscal policies not have been appropriate. In some cases, they were not. In other cases, there were genuine reasons for the debt buildup, including shocks, loss of preferential access to Europe in terms of bananas and sugar, and of course, concessional finance. That said, we are where we are, and we have to move on. So I wanna just say before I conclude that I believe that our region needs to adopt fiscal resilience frameworks with a sense of urgency. Our vulnerability is real, and the next hurricane season is near. We need to broaden and deepen this conversation on inclusive growth and building resilience to build a groundswell of support for the reforms identified in the book. The ECCB has taken steps through our country outreach, where we engage all civil society, we engage the governments, opposition, social partners, including the faith community, our youth, business, banks, and so on, to try to enlarge the space for the key reforms. And we've also, of course, we've started a weekly podcast with ECCB Connects. We now have been doing that for the last 2 years. And of course, our Growth and Resilience Dialogue, which we did for the second year in February of this year. So we want to partner with the fund and of course Marla and others to bring this message across the region and to engage our citizens as we go forward. So I'll leave it here just to say in conclusion on the Grenada specific situation, which of course I was integrally involved with. The debt to GDP ratio in Grenada is somewhere around 69, 70%, coming down from the high of 110%, as I think Uma mentioned. There are some very important lessons from the Grenada experience for the Eastern Caribbean and the wider region. I am particularly pleased with the Fiscal Responsibility Oversight Committee, the FROC, which is an independent body that reports to the Parliament on the compliance with the legislation. I think that's an advance, even on the model we have in Jamaica and in Chile. But certainly, it's something we need to build on and continue to work as we hopefully get other countries to adopt. That is certainly the goal of the Eastern Caribbean. We're at averaging around 70% now in terms of debt to GDP ratio. Our target is to get to 60% by 2030. Some of our countries are already under 70, some are closer to 80. So we've asked everybody to establish interim targets so that to guide us 2020, 2025, so that by the time we get to 2030, we are able to achieve, hopefully well before that in some cases as well. Of course, no one knows the future, and that's why we have to prepare, because the shocks will come, and we have to be prepared to weather those storms. Starting with, I just see fiscal responsibility legislation, fiscal resilience frameworks as a way of giving us a chance, at least. As I put it this way, if you are at the wicket, you can make runs. If you're not at the wicket, you cannot make runs. Giving our economies a chance, our countries a chance to actually achieve and sustain higher levels of inclusive growth, and of course with resilience. So I will leave it at that. And again, thanks for this initiative, and I'm happy to contribute as we go forward.
Oh, thank you so much, Governor. I like that rebranding, fiscal resilience framework. So from now on, I'm never going to say fiscal rules or fiscal responsibility framework again. I love it. I appreciate that contribution. And one of the things that you noted, as well as Uma, that I think is very important is the institutional building, particularly this institution of oversight, independent oversight. I think is obviously made such a big difference. But I appreciate your contribution, Governor, and your participation on our call. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marla.
Thanks. So we'll switch over now to Sebastian and Joyce, and we'll take it from there. Thanks, guys.
Okay. Thank you, Marla. Well, as Uma and the governor mentioned, natural disasters are a big issue for the region. And it's been not only a cause, but also a consequence of the problems on the macro side. Natural disasters contribute to low growth, put pressure on the fiscal frameworks, but also the high levels of debt that the region has and the little buffers that the region has also reduces the ability of countries to respond to natural disasters. Can we go to the next slide, please? And part of the problem for the region is that it's more vulnerable than the rest of the world. And this is not only a characteristic for the Caribbean, it's generally for small islands in the world, but particularly the Caribbean region is affected. The region not only suffer higher frequency of events once you account for the size of the countries, but has also larger damages as a share of GDP. And the impact of these disasters are more detrimental to growth. And this, of course, results in significant human and economic costs. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these three areas next. Can we go to the next slide, please? So if we look at the frequency of events, the larger countries in the world, like the US and China, usually have more disasters per year than the rest of the world. But that's because they have very large land masses. Once you account for the size, you see that the small islands, and the Caribbean in particular, is very vulnerable to natural disasters. If you were to rank all the countries in the world between the most riskiest to the least riskiest in terms of disasters per square kilometer, the 30 top places of the most risky places in the world are all small islands, and most of them are in the Caribbean. Here in this chart, we see the number of disasters per 1,000 square kilometers, and we see that most of the region is well above the world average, which is the red line. Can we go to the next slide, please? Damages in the region usually cause disasters in the region usually cause damages of about 2.4% of GDP per year, while the rest of the world only suffers damages of about 0.4% of GDP every year. So damages in the region are 6 times larger than for the average country in the world. And part of the problem is that when a disaster strikes a small country like in the Caribbean, it affects a much larger part of the land area and their population, and hence has a much bigger impact. If we look at the picture in this next slide, we can see how Hurricane Maria was hitting Dominica in the last hurricane season, and we can see the eye directly hitting the entire country. While when we have disasters or hurricanes in the US, it only affects a couple of states at most, while the rest of the country is unaffected. So to put things in context, the costliest disaster in the US caused damages of about 125 billion, but it was only about 1% of GDP. In the other case, we have a hurricane like Hurricane Ivan in Grenada, which caused less than 1 billion in damages, but that amounted to over 150% of Grenada's GDP in 2004. So the magnitude of the impacts is very different for large countries or for small countries. And that's one of the vulnerabilities of the region. Can we go to the next slide, please? Hello? Yes, so part of the problem is also that the data on damages is substantially underestimated. The information I have here comes from the International Disaster Database, and they record a disaster when one of 3 characteristics fall. Either 10 people were killed, or more than 10 or more people were killed, 100 or more people were affected, and by affected it means they were injured or they had to relocate because their houses were destroyed or damaged, or an international call for assistance was made, or a state of emergency was issued. So if any of those things happen, then that is recorded as a disaster. And the reported damages caused by hurricanes in the region between 1950 and 2014 showed that hurricanes cause on average every year 1.6% in damages. But the thing is that there's about 40% of the disasters in the database do not have any information on damages. And that's not because there were no damages caused by or economic costs caused by the disasters. is because there was no official report that took the time to estimate what were the cost and the economic consequences of these disasters. So I take the information on the hurricane tracks and the information on wind speed, how close the hurricanes came to the islands, and I try to estimate what's the relationship between wind speeds and economic costs. And by doing that, I can try to recreate the missing damages data. And if I do that, damages could be as high as 2.5% of GDP. But there's also evidence, particularly for the 1950s and 60s, that disasters themselves might be underreported. So if we were to include all of that information, damages in the region could average about 5.7% of GDP per year. And this is destruction to houses, to crops, to roads, buildings, schools. And of course, this has a big economic impact on growth. Can we go to the next slide, please? Here we see that the average country in the world, after it suffers a disaster from a hurricane, loses about 1% of GDP per capita after 7 years of the event. However, for the Caribbean, this is 4.5 times larger. So GDP per capita in the region after an average hurricane hits a country is on average 4.5% lower than it would have been if the disaster didn't strike. And this, combined with the frequency of events that the region experiences, is a big problem. These impacts are persistent because despite the reconstruction activity that you see 1 or 2 years after a disaster strikes, still you are only rebuilding what was already there. You're not really increasing the capital stock or the wealth of the country. You're just replacing a hospital or a bridge or a road that got destroyed, but you're not really building the capacity of the country by doing a new hospital or improving the schools. You're just rebuilding what was back there. And that has an impact on growth. This also has an impact on human capital because most of the times schools serve as shelters. So schools are also closed for a while people get relocated and can go back to their homes. And this has an impact on educational attainment, and of course it has an impact on long-term growth. So it's not just the physical infrastructure side, it's also the human capital side that gets affected by disasters and that lowers growth potential in the medium term. Can we go to the next slide, please? So that is why it's essential to build resilience to natural disasters. This takes information from the World Bank that estimated how much does it pay to prepare or prevent for different types of events. And the red dotted line shows the break-even point. So investments to prevent floods or to minimize the effects of floods or tropical storms or earthquakes more than pay for themselves. The question is then how to make enough fiscal space so that countries in the region can actually take these investments forward. And that's part of what UMA discussed in detail about how countries should approach this. Can we go to this next slide, please? So some of our policy recommendations are build buffers, as Uma mentioned. We need to account for the annual expected damages caused by disasters. So that's where the frequency of events, the size of the damages that they cause, and the impact on growth are important factors that we need to account, that countries need to understand to be better prepared. And they need to build comprehensive risk management strategies that account for these factors and that let them be ready for when a disaster strikes. Instead of reacting to the disaster, being really prepared beforehand, it means also knowing where your financing is going to come from when a disaster strikes, is knowing how you can move resources from certain parts of the budget to the disaster effort. Means having already discussions with providers and suppliers and have ready laws or regulation that allows you to bypass some of your procurement processes, but just for the event of disasters where you have already vendors that are pre-approved for this kind of things. It means also having better insurance, not only at the government sector, but also at the private sector. It means having a frank discussions in the countries where the government clearly states what is its role after a disaster strikes and which part of the population is going to be provided help and what amount. Because part of what we see in the region is that people don't really buy insurance unless it's mandated by their bank or their credit union for their mortgages. But once these things, the mortgages are paid, people usually drop insurance because they kind of think of the government as the insurance of last resort. But that's expectation sometimes falls short because the government cannot do everything for everybody. So having a frank discussion of where the role of the government is will also help the private sector know that they need to buy insurance and they need to be prepared because the government will not be able to cover the needs of everyone and will only focus on the low-income population that is the one that gets most affected and needs more stuff. Self-adaptation is also important, like building codes and zoning laws, and enforcement of those is critical. And building resilient infrastructure to adapt, not only to account for the type of damages and type of events that we suffer today, but to adapt to climate change, which is expected to exacerbate and worsen the intensity of hurricanes, floods, droughts in the future. Can we go to the next slide, please? And I really like this quote from a manager at the National Disaster Management Agency in India that says, "We've done a good job at saving lives. We have to do a much better job at saving livelihoods." The impact of disasters on lives has decreased dramatically over the past half century. And that's because we have better early warning systems that warn people to take shelter and to prepare for disasters. But the impact on the economy is still large, and that's where we need better, more work to be done. And why is it important to build resilient infrastructure? Well, we have three factors. One is the human. Of course, better infrastructure protects lives, also helps protect livelihoods and well-being of the people. You have the economic side of it. It's that the constant reconstruction mode is unaffordable. You cannot have countries continually rebuild the same school, the same road, the same bridge over and over again. That is not cost efficient, and that is not something that any country in the world can afford for a prolonged period of time. And there's also the systemic issue where you don't want to make your infrastructure systemically uninsurable. That is, if you keep building low quality infrastructure, nobody's going to want to insure that because it will be known that it cannot sustain or withstand the impact of natural disasters and climate change. So 3 steps that are needed for building resilient infrastructure is map it, price it, and build it. By map it, what we mean is where are the risk areas? Need hazard maps that show where are the most risky areas for floods, for sea erosion, for hurricane activity, and building in the right place is half the battle, because if you build in the wrong place, you need to build much more costly to build the resilience that you need to sustain disasters. And by price it, we mean that we need to understand what are the costs of vulnerable infrastructure and what are the long-term returns of resilience. So projects need to be evaluated on the life cycle cost benefit analysis, meaning you have, probably as a slightly higher cost of building a resilient bridge right now, but knowing that you will need lower maintenance costs, that it will sustain much more higher flows, and that will not be damaged by future floods or hurricanes or other type of events, will reduce costs in the long term, and that needs to be understood. And by building it, it means incorporate all this information into the building of the infrastructure, not let it be just an academic exercise, but actually prepare the infrastructure to work like this. Can we go to this next slide, please? So finally, we think that the international community also has a role to play in the region by helping building capacity and risk management designing of contingency plans. Also to helping develop insurance and financial instruments to share risks. The Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, CRIF, is a very good example of this, but also developing more space for catastrophe bonds and for natural disaster clauses in loan arrangements, for example, like Grenada has since a couple of years back, will be important. But so far, these markets have been kind of niche and very, and sometimes costly. So a more widespread use of this type of financial instruments would reduce their cost and benefit the region in lowering the cost of accessing insurance. And finally, ex-ante financing and climate financing will be key. By ex-ante financing, we mean that sometimes assistance comes only after a disaster has already happened. And that is usually more costly than coming beforehand and helping the countries retrofit buildings or strengthen the resilience of infrastructure that is there, or building infrastructure that is resilient in the first place. And sometimes that is much cost efficient than rebuilding and repairing damages after the fact. And also making more easily access to climate financing for both mitigation and adaptation purposes will be key. So with that, I leave you with my colleague.
Let me try to get to the camera. Hi, good morning, everybody. So let me just segue from what both Uma and Sebastian have discussed on the need for fiscal space, the need for resources in order to build better. And also let me piggyback on what Governor Antoine mentioned about the need for inclusive growth. So one of the things is, how do we channel these resources? And what I'm going to talk about is both at the higher level, how do we develop markets to make sure that resources are going towards their most efficient use, going towards the areas where we can generate the most growth. But I'll also be touching about the inclusion portion, which much more will look at how do we make sure that SMEs, that small entrepreneurs, get those same gains from the financial markets, and therefore they can also, and therefore the gains from growth are spread out across the distribution. So on the next slide, please. So financial development has been shown in old literature all throughout that it can have a positive impact on countries' income levels. And this chart is merely just showing a correlation. It's really just a cloud, but it's really just to let me to say that financial development, the channels through which it works, it's one, it channels resources towards productive projects. It goes to the most efficient use. Two, it can provide insurance. As Sebastian just mentioned, the financial markets can provide insurance, not just for disasters, but also even democratic shocks that each one of us may experience. So health shocks, career shocks, etc.
Please hold while we direct your call.
And
at the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, we are committed to serving the people of the ECCU through a strong and thriving currency union. For more information about us, visit our website at www.eccb-centralbank.org or check out our YouTube channel, ECCB
When a shock hits you, hopefully you will not get all the brunt of it, and you will have some sort of a safety net. On next chart, please.
I'm sorry, Joyce. You're gonna have to give me a second. I'm trying to disconnect the governor. He had us on hold and
No problem.
Hello?
All right.
sorry about that, Joyce. You can go ahead.
Yep, thank you. So how do we measure it now that we've established it's important? Once again, the literature has focused on very narrow measures. So things like credit to GDP, which many of you have probably seen, things like stock market capitalization, stock market turnover, ratio of liquid liabilities in the financial sector. These are very narrow measures in the sense that they basically only look at one aspect of financial development, each one of them. What we have done, and this is based on work that was actually done in the IMF by the Monetary and Capital Markets Department. This was a working paper we did focusing on Latin America and the Caribbean using the same methodology. And what we do is that we build a much broader index. We say that in terms of financial development, what are the important things? We have institutions and we have markets. And how do we measure, what are the aspects about these things that matter to us? We care about access, how easily people, agents can access markets and institutions. How deep are they? How deep is the institutional depth, and therefore how much the costs of accessing these institutions may be? How deep are the markets? And how efficiently do they run? So banking competition, and then on this market side, we have things like the stock market turnover ratio. And why is this broad index important? The narrow measures work very well if all your interest is in that one measure. But what has happened in the financial sector in the last 2-3 decades is that we've seen a large expansion away from just banking, which, for example, things like credit to GDP would measure, but moving towards non-banking financial services. There's been a big expansion in mutual funds, pension funds, insurance services. So this broader index allows us to capture in one shot all of these aspects of each country and try to measure and try to compare them across countries. So let us see now how the Caribbean is doing on the next slide. Because of data constraints, we were only able to have 4 Caribbean countries on this index. There's a lot of data and this is a long panel. So we include Bahamas, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, and Jamaica on this index. And as you can see, they're in very different stages on the left-hand chart. The yellow columns are the Caribbean countries. And you see that Bahamas and Barbados are broadly on the top half in overall financial development. And Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica are broadly on the second half, but with Jamaica trailing. So now what we do is we're going to unpack across the markets and institutions and depth, access, and efficiency and see how these countries are doing. And that's what we do on the right-hand chart. All of the Caribbean countries do very well in terms of depth. And you can see that this is the first stack of columns on the chart. And you see, and a part of this is driven by large debt placements. In Jamaica's case, for the government, and in Bahamas, Barbados, and Trinidad's case, for both corporate financial and corporate non-financial sector. In terms of access and efficiency to markets, it's much weaker. The access is basically dominated by a few large corporates who issue a lot, contributing to depth, but there aren't that many accessing it. And in terms of efficiency, it's the same issue. There's very little market activity. The turnover is very weak. In the financial institution side, Trinidad, Barbados, and Bahamas are broadly in line with the LAC average, which is the last column on each group. So you can see that some countries perform actually better than the LAC average. You can see, for example, Barbados in terms of depth of financial institutions, and the same thing with Bahamas. But as a general snapshot, Jamaica is the one that is still trailing. It trails sometimes compared to the LAC average, and it certainly trails compared to the other 3 Caribbean countries. And a lot of this is coming through, we see it in the features of the Jamaican institutions. We see a fairly concentrated banking sector. We have relatively large loan deposit spreads. Very few companies are having access to finance, and credit to GDP and deposits to GDP are relatively low. On the next slide, please. So let us now zoom in on the inclusion side. How are households as SMEs doing? And if we look on the left side where we just showed the physical access to finance, we see that about half of the Caribbean countries are underserved, quote unquote, when compared to lack. So this just measures how easy is it for me to access a banking point, to access some sort of an agent that performs banking services. And one caveat about this measure, and this is a measure we use because it's widely available, one caveat is that in the Caribbean countries, because there is a large amount of ATMs often in tourism sites, it brings out the question of concentration. While there are a large number of ATM access points, they might be concentrated in very urban areas and very touristy areas, but it doesn't mean, for example, that rural access is good. And for example, a model that has been vastly used in smaller Latin American countries, the banking agent model, where, for example, a little corner shop takes on banking services and you can go there and cash your checks and deposit your money. That model hasn't been developed much in the Caribbean. On the right-hand side chart, we now look at SMEs. And once again, we see that about half, slightly more here, of SMEs in the region say that access to credit is a major constraint to their business. And this, we're going to unpack it next. And this is basically, we're looking at about like 1/3 at least in each country will cite access to credit as a major issue. On the next slide, we now unpack to why through what channels some of these constraints are working. So we have high loan deposit spreads, as I mentioned before. For the Caribbean countries that we bring into the analysis, just about all of them, except for Bahamas, have a loan deposit spread which is about double or more that of what we see in advanced economies. We're not saying that it should be the same as advanced economies, but this signals that there might be some scope to lowering this, or at least examining what might be driving these high loan deposit spreads. On the center chart, we have the levels of collateral. And the Caribbean, it's not just that there are very high levels of collateral required behind each loan, it's also that often the definition of collateral is very narrow. So things like working capital might not be accepted as collateral. Factoring and leasing are still very not developed in the region. So it's not just the levels that we show here, but often it also tends to be the definition of collateral. And all of this ends, we see that it leads to firms having low access to credit. So once again, about 1/3 of the firms at least report having no access to banking credit. And in the work that we have done, we actually find that it's not a lack of demand. What we see is that very often these companies end up in the World Bank Enterprise Survey, they openly say that they borrow from family and friends, they borrow from informal channels. So it's not that there is no demand, it's just that there seems to be a lack of banking access. Next slide, please. So given all of these issues, all of these constraints, so we have the collateral constraints, we have things like, how do I access credit? And we have things like this, the interest rate spread. How should one think about what policies? And how should one think about which is the constraint that's most important to my country as a policymaker? So what we do is that we take a model that is able then to tell us, well, if I loosen collateral constraint, let's say, what are the trade-offs between getting more growth out of relaxing that constraint versus, for example, making inequality worse? Because echoing again Governor Antoine on the inclusive growth need, sometimes you might have unexpected effects from loosening a constraint that you think might be fantastic for growth, but it actually benefits large firms. And this is, for example, the effect of loosening a collateral constraint. How does this work in the model? In the model, and just to give an intuition on the real world, once you lower collateral constraints, the big firms who are able to place large collateral, they can then there's a multiplier effect on how much credit they can get, and then suddenly they can grow a lot faster and a lot bigger into the economy. So what you end up having is that your inequality becomes slightly worse, but you get a big bang for the buck in terms of growth. So these are the two charts. We show that the effect on GDP from loosening participation constraint, the interest rate spreads, and the collateral constraint. And then we also show that when you loosen all of these constraints together, there is actually a nonlinear effect. So when you loosen one constraint all the way, you might actually get less than, for example, if you improve the spreads, lower fixed costs to entering a credit market, and then also lower collateral requirements, all a little bit all across, you might get an extra bump from it, from just the interaction and all three have. On the right-hand side chart, we have the effect on inequality. And what you can see is that improving participation constraints is better across the board towards inequality. And why is this? Just as an intuition. What we think of as participation constraints to credit markets is often fixed costs. So it's often being able to have good accounting, being able to have organized books, a good business plan, good documentation. These are all one-time fixed costs often, which are much bigger on SMEs, smaller, actually micro firms. So the smaller a firm you are, the bigger the percentage costs these things are to you. So lowering paperwork, lowering bureaucratic red tape actually ends up having the biggest impact on small firms. So this allows them to be able to enter, to be able to provide documentation, to be able to have good accounting in a way that before they were never able to if the costs were too high for them. So this is really an illustrative model, and there's a lot more detail about this. I'm happy to answer any questions that arise. But this is really just to give an intuition on some constraints might help you if you are looking for growth and you're looking for a fast overall growth for the country. But if there's also concerns about how this growth is distributed across the economy, and if there's concerns about how this affects inequality and inclusive growth, then one should be aware that there might be trade-offs across the two sides. So if, for example, you're lowering collateral constraints to get a big bang for the buck on growth, perhaps also be careful and watch out for the participation constraints and lower fixed costs of SMEs of entering into the credit market. So next slide, please. I will just wrap it all up. And these are really quick findings. And the biggest finding I want to point out actually is that the significant data gaps in the region actually hamper analysis. As you saw, when we first constructed the Financial Deepening Index, we were not even able to get data from many of the countries in the region. So as a big first step is really data collection so that we can at least measure where many of the Caribbean countries are at this point in financial development. In terms of financial inclusion, they're doing well for the country. We're about half are doing fairly well. So we're not lagging too much behind the rest of Latin America. But there is a need still to support SMEs. And as the model showed very quickly, there is no silver bullet solution for each country. So it's not like I say, you lower collateral constraints, you're gonna, of course, be fine. For each country, there's gotta be a different mix of policies. And as the nonlinear effect wanted to show in a very theoretical kind of approach, there's gonna be synergies that come from a multi-pronged approach where you target several constraints at the same time and loosen each one of them and take a look at what the effect is on the economy. With that, I wrap, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Joyce, and also to Sebastian. Thanks so much. Fascinating. I didn't realize that there were non-linear effects to having a multi-pronged approach. I would have thought it would have been linear. So that for me, that last point was quite fascinating. And Sebastian, I mean, I've been a fan of your work and cited it many times, but it's so stark to see that, 7 years after, you still have a significant impact on GDP of, 5.7% of GDP is the cost of natural disasters from 1950 to 2014. 5.7% of GDP per annum seems to me to it just boggles the mind, because so many of us struggle to get even 1%. And even a big country like Trinidad, we struggle to get these numbers. But I don't want to rehash everything you all said. I would like to turn to the audience to see if we have any questions from the audience that might have come through. Melissa, are you seeing any?
Yes, we have several questions, and a lot of them reflect on the same topic. So I'm kind of going to try and group them together because we have run over time as well. Uma, I'm just going to let you know I can unmute your line and you can mute yourself. I know you're in a public space, so if you have background noise and want to mute yourself, you can go ahead and do that. One of the main questions that we've gotten is, what advice would you give to members of a society that in those countries where the government is resistant to external help from the IMF, even though all the signs point to the need to do so? How do you press for change when the perception within the country is that external help is detrimental?
I'm happy to answer that question. Thank you, Melissa, for that question. This is indeed tricky. It is not, I'm not embarrassed to admit, because it is a fact that, countries do have, there's a stigma associated with coming to the fund because it kind of tells the outside world, or at least countries perceive that it tells the outside world that, things are so wrong that they need external help to put their house in order. But there are two parts to this. One is it's not necessarily the case, as we have shown with our work in two countries in the region. We come in to partner with the countries that we are working with, and I can, without reservation, say that in the case of Jamaica, for which I am the mission chief, that we partner with the government every step of the way, and we are in it to make Jamaican economy successful. It is not about any particular policy that there are good practices, and we do want the country, when it reforms, to have sustainable policies that will be able to carry it through the long run and not just short-term patchwork or band-aid type solutions. So, with that focus, we are partnering with the countries that we work with to make long-term solutions materialize. The problem with waiting too long and governments resisting to come to the fund is, as I said before, both Jamaica and Grenada came to the fund when it was a crisis. That is not necessarily the best strategy, because you don't want to be in a position where you're hitting the wall before you start turning your country around. The turnaround, once the red flags start emerging, or even well before that, if you're already in the territory of red flags, it's time to turn around. But if you're not in the territory of red flags, but you see that in 5 years or 7 years, your debt is reaching a path where it is unsustainable, or you're reaching a point where fiscal space is not going to be available, either, you don't have to come to the fund. You have to own the policies and introduce discipline in a way that your economy can go forward in a sustainable manner. So, so the two parts to my answer is, one, if you hit a crisis point, then you're left with not many options. And so if you don't want to hit that crisis point, the periodic stock taking and reversing course where you might be going wrong is the way forward. So countries, prolonged path of non-resilient policy making, to use the governor's words, is not helpful. And so countries have to choose the path that they want to take.
May I add to that? It's funny that you talk about the fact that, we all seem to wait until there's a crisis to run to the IMF. I mean, one wonders if the IMF can plant spies or do covert work in countries that the government doesn't then have to admit defeat, quote unquote, and face the political cost of that. But on a more serious note, I think that the reason that happens is because it's tantamount to political suicide, right? To invite the IMF in. And so nobody wants to do that, especially if they're seeking re-election. So what I think is really important is to break that mental connection between the IMF and the policymakers themselves being inept or ineffective in what they're supposed to be doing. There has to be, again, sort of a rebranding of that perception we have in the Caribbean of what the IMF really is, and not as a rescue mission so much, but just as an international support. The same way you have, say, diplomatic, presence from other countries and they're helpful to you, like the Chinese and the UK and the US governments, for example. To me, it would be more helpful if the IMF had that type of a perception as opposed to a rescue mission. But again, over time, that's just the image that has developed in the Caribbean, and perhaps it's something for people like the Jamaicans, the Grenadans, myself, all of us to do some work to help change that perception that the public has. The politicians don't help because they demonize the IMF as well. And every time there is an election coming up, you hear them saying things like, oh, if you vote for that party, they're going to take us straight to the IMF. Whereas our party, we'll fix the problem on our own. So it doesn't help when the politicians themselves demonize the IMF in this region. That has a significant part to play as to why the perception is what it is. But I completely agree that it shouldn't be where there is this view that the IMF is just there for when there is a crisis, and that we should all grow to accept that it isn't just for a crisis. The IMF can be there for us to I mean, just the analysis that you have in this book that shows the level of support and guidance that could be had outside of a crisis situation. So yeah, that's my bit. I don't know if Governor has anything to add there.
Well, Marla, what I would say is that it's three things. First of all, there obviously are political risks with any structural adjustment program, IMF or not. And the results are mixed. I mean, I have at least two countries in the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union, Dominica and Grenada, that have had programs and had governments re-elected after those programs. In those cases, the case was made, the people understood. The government got in front of the issues once they made the hard decisions, and the population rewarded them by re-electing them. So it is not a foregone conclusion that it's political suicide. As I said, there are risks, no doubt about that, but obviously the most recent experience, example, is Grenada, which just came off elections a few weeks ago. The second issue is that the point I'll make is that, our countries are members of the IMF for a reason. And when you have a challenge, your membership should count. So I understand the stigma and all of that, but you have to, I guess, sometimes swallow our pride and do what is right, not necessarily what is most expedient. I know that's easier said than done for those who are, especially those of us who are not running for office. We don't perhaps feel the same strain and anxieties. But at the end of the day, the IMF is there for, we're members for a reason, and we need to avail ourselves of the technical support and other financial support that comes with the fund. Thirdly and fundamentally, whatever you decide, it is ultimately a program that the country has to own. And so, people sometimes laugh when you say, well, a homegrown program supported by the IMF, because they see that as a misnomer. They can't understand how could you have a homegrown program and at the same time have the IMF present. What homegrown really speaks to is the fact that you have owned the reforms. You have accepted the situation. You have engaged in a wide dialogue, widespread dialogue within the citizenry, within the social partners, and you have come to a conclusion on the key reforms. So, for example, in Grenada, when we sat around the table with the social partners, we agreed that we would not do mass retrenchment. So, or retrenchment in the public service. So, yes, we had to find ways to cut expenditure. There were taxes on the income side, the revenue side, to help with the fiscal imbalance. But we decided we would not, and it was a collaborative decision. The union said no. Obviously, we're concerned about the impact on workers. The business community said that will affect aggregate demand. The churches said we're concerned about the social justice implications. And obviously, the government would have been concerned from the political side as well. But together, we found other ways on the income side and also the revenue side to cut expenditure. And we decided we would not do mass retrenchment. So, yes, we had to find ways to cut expenditure. And yes, we would not do mass retrenchment. we took the attrition policy very seriously in terms of reducing the size of the public service, so that without sending home anybody over 3 years, we were able to reduce the public service by 800, just by having a very strict attrition policy that was fully elaborated and endorsed by the cabinet. So I'm just giving that as a simple example to show that at the end of the day, the design of the IMF will give ideas, will give views. Something that people don't know very well, that's not well known in Grenada, is not the IMF that came up with fiscal responsibility legislation in Grenada. It came from yours truly, acting then as PS in the Ministry of Finance, and then went to the Prime Minister, who fully supported it. Obviously, I had been through the trenches as a public servant, and I had seen the vagaries of the cycle and all the difficulties with it and the need for it. Now, the IMF was willing to come on board and support it, but it did not come from the IMF. It was not a demand made by the IMF. The IMF did not ask us to do this. We could check the mission chief, Aliona Sebotari, to confirm this. So I'm just making the point, at the end of the day, it's all about ownership. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Governor.
The next question that I have, and again, I've gotten a lot along this line, so I'm just going to reduce it to one. What are the more pro-growth policies and reforms that can be implemented to build resilience along the lines of business recovery and high-quality employment?
Pro-growth policy along the lines of business recovery and high-quality employment. I would say, I'd be happy for the others to join in. I would say in terms of pro-growth and business development, I think it's very important for us to have doing business reforms. There is no shortage of information in the competitiveness index and the doing business index. What are the constraints to doing business in the Caribbean, and what are the constraints to private sector-led growth? A lot of them center around public sector reform. And so, as Uma mentioned, 180 public institutions in Jamaica on a per capita basis, one of the highest, and certainly a lot more than they needed. And these kinds of pro-business, pro-doing business reforms and public sector reforms, I think, are key to unlocking growth that is pro-business and high-quality employment. Because let's face it, there is no point in having a bloated public sector of people who, let's just say, in some countries, certainly in Trinidad, I could say, some of the public sector is a make-work program. And there's no point in putting people in these jobs that they really don't want and they're really not happy in and it's not fulfilling. Why not have a private sector-led growth strategy and facilitate business and facilitate entrepreneurship better, so that people can do the things they really want to do and that is more fulfilling for them and therefore better for the economy overall. That's just my own view.
I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
Yeah, I would add to that, and in the same line that Marla was mentioning, that energy reform is also important for the region. The region is heavily dependent on fossil fuels for energy, and that is costly. And most of the firms in the region complain about high cost of electricity and energy for doing businesses. So making efforts to diversify the energy matrix in the region, to have more renewables and to include cheaper sources like natural gas to replace oil and diesel could help also the region, on the one hand, become less dependent on imports of fossil fuels. If you go the renewable route, reduce costs, and also importantly reduce carbon emissions, and which is a good signal for the rest of the world that is fighting climate change, and that could also help attract financing for climate change and for adaptation purposes.
I believe that Uma would like to chime in. Melissa, is it possible to unmute her?
Yes, she's self-muted, so she'll need to unmute herself. There you go.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so thank you. I just want to weigh in on a couple of things. Pro-growth policies. There's no magic bullet to what is a pro-growth policy. It really depends on the problems that each of these countries face. But one of the broader problems when you talk about high quality jobs, pro-growth policies, private sector, etc., the role of the government is to create an enabling, not a disabling environment for the private sector in order for private sector to become dynamic and provide the jobs that are needed, the high quality jobs that you mentioned. So in some countries, for example, in Jamaica, the red tape, the bureaucracy, and our pet example is the procurement policy, which is a horrendous process, and it takes forever to get things done. And so there are efficiencies to be gained from addressing some of these bureaucratic problems that the private sector confront in order to do business there. The second thing, and this Joyce touched on in her paper, is access to finance. You cannot have growth in a country unless it starts from the base. The base has to be strong. It is not created by 2 or 3 large corporates that they cannot carry the economy. It has to be carried from the base. And in order for that to happen, you need access to finance for small, medium enterprises. And we don't even know what the scale of the problem is because of the data that is not available. So I think that is again a fundamental issue that needs to be considered. The third thing, and it goes back to partly what Sebastian was talking about, and this goes to the resilience and the impact of the agricultural sector and the absence of its ability to withstand shocks. And the shocks are abundant. I'm not talking about hurricanes. I'm just talking about regular rainy season, and that wipes out your agricultural stock. So how do you build resilience in the agricultural sector in a way that you're able to leverage that as an input into your hotel sector? I think there's a huge growth potential there that has not been tapped in the Caribbean fully. And the fourth thing, and goes back to the government, is as long as the government stays big, it is going to crowd out the private sector. And the private sector is not going to be able to do because what it's supposed to do, because they are quite happy to be buying the government bonds and making quick money from a business model that is not growth driven. So, so I think there's a connection there that needs to be broken so that the private sector can do the role it is supposed to do. Thank you.
You just answered between Sebastian and Uma, you just answered the next 2 questions I had to ask. So I think, Marla, we can go ahead and wrap it up, and you can go to concluding remarks.
Okay, yes. So, because it's now been an hour and a half almost, I just wanted to say again, thank you so much to Uma, Joyce, Sebastian, and Governor Antwine for joining us to have these important discussions on and ventilating some of the issues that we face and the challenges we face in the Caribbean. Again, I appreciate the work that you and your colleagues have done at the IMF in putting together this book, which, I mean, I will do my best to promote and make sure that everybody has an opportunity to look at and benefit from the work that you do. This problem of a lack of data in the region that could inform better analysis and better policy formulation, of course, is widespread and perennial, it seems, in the region, and one that we domestically as well as you guys would appreciate is so frustrating. And I completely agree with you there. If you have any closing remarks you want to make in a minute or two, now is your chance. But I just wanted to again express my appreciation.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you very greatly, Marla and Melissa, for organizing this event. I think it's a fantastic opportunity for us to talk about, a few things that we have in the book. And also, I think this is a very efficient and cost-effective way for everybody to do it. So I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you. The book is very rich. The book is very rich in terms of the analysis and the topics it covers. So, it goes way beyond what our traditional IMF topics are, which people tend to think of as fiscal and monetary. We talk about crime in that book. We talk about energy issues in that book. We talk about natural disasters, correspondent banking. I mean, it covers a wide spectrum of issues, and we are happy to engage with all countries in any of those topics because we do want to customize our advice to the problems of each country. And it's not, fiscal policy just happens to be the center of the discussion, given that it pervades all these countries. But we are happy to engage at all levels, and our technical assistance program is also pretty hefty in the region, which many countries do avail of, both for data issues and for fine-tuning policy issues. So we look forward to continued engagement with the region, and we are at your service. So whatever we can do to make things better, we will do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uma. Thank you. Sebastian and Joyce.
I just want to mention that the book is available to download online for free. So I think we didn't mention that. So anyone can look at the book. Just Google Unleashing Growth in the Caribbean IMF, and you will get directed to the link, and you can read some of the chapters.
It's very important that you mentioned that. And so what I think Melissa and I can do is, when we send out the link to the replay on YouTube for this webinar, we'll include the link to that book so that people can actually reference it. So it's important that you mention that. Thank you, Sebastian.
And thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. And we have Governor Antwine. Any closing remarks, Governor?
Well, just thank you to the IMF for the book, and to you for facilitating the conversation we've had today. Let's keep it going.
Thank you. Thanks for your participation. And thanks to everybody who stayed with us on the line this long. Much appreciated. Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely day.
Thank you, Marla.
Bye.
Bye.